moments in life when pain feels like a defining force. It lingers, weighs heavy, and makes us question everything, our worth, our direction, even God's presence. But pain was never meant to define you. It was never meant to be the label you carry. You are not what happened to you. You are not the disappointment, the heartbreak, or the rejection. You are marked by God for something greater, and that means even your pain has a purpose. See, when God marks you, he doesn't just mark the good parts of your story. He marks the entire journey. The things you celebrate and the things you wish you could erase. The moments you felt strong and the moments you barely held on. Every single piece of your life is being used to shape you for something beyond what you can see right now. But here's the tension. Pain speaks loudly. It demands, it tells you that you are forgotten, that you are unworthy, that you are stuck. And if you're not careful, you start believing the lies that come with it. But I want to challenge you today. What if the pain you're experiencing is not a sign that you are abandoned, but a sign that you are being prepared? What if the very thing that made you feel disqualified is the thing God is using to qualify you? When you understand that you are marked by God, you begin to realize that nothing in your life is random. There is not one season, not one setback, not one tear that God will waste. I think about Joseph in the Bible, a man who was given a dream of greatness but had to walk through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment before he ever saw that dream become reality. At any moment, he could have looked at his life and said, maybe I heard God wrong. Maybe I'm not chosen. Maybe this is just who I am, a person who suffers. But even in the lowest places, Joseph was still marked, even when his surroundings didn't reflect his calling. His calling never left him. And the same is true for you. The enemy wants nothing more than to use pain to make you forget who you are. He wants to use discouragement to silence you, to make you shrink back, to make you settle for less. But when you know that you are marked by God, you fight back differently. You don't just react to life, you rise. You remind yourself that no matter what it looks like right now, God is still in control. And let me tell you something. When you shift your perspective on pain, it loses its power to define you. When you stop seeing pain as punishment and start seeing it as preparation, something changes in you. You stop asking, why me? And start asking, what is God doing in me? Because the truth is, pain has a way of producing something in us that comfort never could. It builds resilience. It sharpens our faith. It deepens our dependence on God. Maybe you're walking through a season right now where everything feels uncertain. Maybe you're carrying disappointment, frustration, or even anger toward God because you don't understand why things happened the way they did. I get it. But I need you to know this is not where your story ends. You are marked. You are chosen. And if you don't quit, if you don't let the weight of what you feel stop you, you will see why you had to walk through this. But God does not mark people without intention. He does not anoint you and then abandon you. If he placed a purpose inside of you, then he is committed to bringing it to completion. So don't let pain convince you that you are disqualified. Don't let temporary emotions make permanent decisions. This season is not breaking you, it is building you. Hold on. Because the pain you're facing today is nothing compared to the purpose that is on the other side of it. Perspective is everything. Two people can go through the exact same situation, but how they see it will determine how they come out of it. One person will see it as the end while the other sees it as a beginning. One will see it as a setback, the other as a setup. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in how they see it. The enemy knows this. Which is why his greatest weapon against you isn't just the attack itself. It's how he manipulates your perspective about it. When life hits hard, the first thing the enemy attacks is the way you see your situation. He wants you to believe that you are stuck, that things will never change, that you will never be free from this cycle of frustration, disappointment, and pain. He wants to convince you that what you see right now is all there will ever be. And if he can distort your vision, he can control your decisions. If he can make you believe that what you're going through is pointless, he can make you quit before the promise ever comes to pass. But here's what I need you to understand. What you are looking at is not the full picture. There is more happening than what you can see. What looks like rejection could actually be redirection. What feels like loss could actually be preparation for greater gain. What seems like the end of something might actually be the beginning of something God has been orchestrating for you all along. This is why the Bible reminds us to walk by faith and not by sight, because sight will deceive you. If you only rely on what you see, you will always be limited by your present reality instead of living in the expectation of what God is doing behind the scenes. Think about the Israelites when they were standing at the edge of the Red Sea. Behind them was Pharaoh's army coming to destroy them. And in front of them was an impossible body of water. From their perspective, they were trapped. There was no way forward. There was no hope. And in their frustration, they cried out, wishing they had never even left Egypt in the first place. Their perspective made them believe that where they had been was better than where they were going. But God had already gone ahead of them. What they thought was the end was actually the exact place where he was about to show his power. The very thing they thought would destroy them, deep, impassable waters, was the thing God used to bring them into their promise. How many times do we do the same thing? How many times do we assume that because something looks impossible, it must be over? How many times do we allow fear, doubt, and disappointment to convince us that our best days are behind us? But what if instead of letting our circumstances shape our faith, we let our faith shape how we see our circumstances? What if we stopped saying, God, why is this happening to me? And started saying, God, what are you doing in me through this? The greatest transformation happens when we allow God to shift our perspective, when we stop seeing closed doors as rejection and start seeing them as protection. When we stop seeing waiting seasons as wasted time and start seeing them as preparation. When we stop seeing pain as punishment and start seeing it as the birthplace of something greater. And when we do that, when we change how we see, we change how we move. We stop reacting out of fear and start responding in faith. We stop being controlled by our emotions and stop being led by truth. So I want to challenge you today. What if you're not as stuck as you think you are? What if you're not losing, but God is positioning you? What if everything you've been frustrated about is actually working together in ways you can't yet comprehend? The moment you shift your perspective, the weight you've been carrying will begin to lift. The fear that has been keeping you paralyzed will start to lose its grip, because when you see differently, you move differently. And when you move differently, you start stepping into the greater purpose that God has had for you all along. Feelings are real, but they are not always true. They are powerful, but they are not permanent. And if we're not careful, we can allow our emotions to dictate our decisions instead of allowing truth to guide us. There will be days when you don't feel strong, when you don't feel chosen, when you don't feel like you're walking in purpose. But your calling is not based on how you feel. It is based on what God has spoken over you. This is why faith has to be greater than feelings. Feelings will tell you to quit, but faith reminds you why you started. Feelings will tell you that you are forgotten, but faith reminds you that God's promises are still true. Feelings will try to convince you that this season of struggle is all there will ever be, but faith knows that what you see today is not the end of your story. The danger comes when we start making permanent decisions based on temporary emotion, because emotions shift. What feels overwhelming today may look completely different tomorrow. And if we allow ourselves to be led by what we feel in the moment, we risk walking away from something God is still working on. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The weight of what was ahead of him was so heavy that he cried out, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." That was his feeling in the moment, overwhelmed, burdened, in deep sorrow. But his next words changed everything. "Yet not my will, but yours be done." He didn't allow his feelings to lead him. He let his faith in the Father's plan take precedence. And because of that, he fulfilled his purpose. There will be moments when what you feel does not match what God has promised. You will feel discouraged. You will feel unqualified. You will feel like nothing is moving forward. But in those moments, you have a choice. Will you follow your feelings or will you stand on faith? Will you allow emotions to dictate your actions, or will you trust that even when you don't see it, God is still working? The enemy loves to use emotions as a tool of distraction. If he can't take your calling, he will try to make you abandon it by making you feel like it's not working. He will use delay to make you feel forgotten. He will use disappointment to make you feel like you heard God wrong. But you must remind yourself that faith is not based on what you feel. It is based on what you know. And what you know is that God does not change his mind about you. There's a story in the Bible about Elijah, a man who had seen God do miracles, fire from heaven, provision in famine, the raising of the dead. But after one threat from Jezebel, fear overtook him. He ran, hid in a cave, and told God, I have had enough. He let the weight of his emotions convince him that his purpose was over. And I wonder how many of us have been in that place where the pressure, the fear, and the disappointment make us want to walk away from everything. But here's what I love. God did not respond to Elijah's feelings with condemnation. He responded with truth. He reminded Elijah that he was not finished with him. And that same truth applies to you. Just because you feel tired does not mean you are defeated. Just because you feel stuck does not mean you are not growing. Just because you feel unseen does not mean God has forgotten about you. This is why you cannot trust every emotion that comes your way. You have to test it against truth. Is what I'm feeling in alignment with what God has said? Or is it fear? Is it doubt? Is it an attack meant to shake my faith? Because when you recognize that, you can take authority over it. You can tell your feelings, you are not in control here. My faith is. So today I encourage you, don't let temporary emotions make permanent decisions. Don't let feelings talk you out of what God has called you to. Stand on truth, not just on what you feel. Because feelings will fade, but God's word over your life will never change. Doubt is one of the greatest enemies of purpose. It sneaks in quietly, often in the form of questions that sound harmless at first. Am I really called? Did I really hear God? What if I'm not good enough? And before you even realize it, those small whispers begin to shape the way you move, the way you think, the way you see yourself. Doubt doesn't just make you question the promise. It makes you question if you were ever chosen in the first place. And that's the goal of the enemy. If he can't take away your calling, he will do everything in his power to make you walk away from it. He will plant seeds of doubt in your mind, using fear, comparison, and disappointment to make you second guess what God has already spoken over your life. Because if you don't believe you are called, you won't move like someone who is. If you don't believe you are equipped, you won't step out in confidence. The enemy knows that as long as you stay in doubt, you will never fully step into what God has for you. Think about Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses' first response wasn't excitement. It was doubt. Who am I to do this? What if they don't believe me? I'm not a good speaker. He had a list of reasons why he wasn't qualified, even though God had already marked him for the assignment. And that's exactly what doubt does. It makes you focus on your limitations instead of God's power. It makes you believe that because you don't have all the answers, you must not be the right person. But God didn't choose Moses because of his ability. He chose him because of his own sovereignty. And the same is true for you. Doubt thrives in uncertainty. The moment things don't go the way you expected, doubt tries to convince you that maybe you heard God wrong. Maybe this wasn't your purpose after all. But you cannot allow a moment of uncertainty to override everything God has already shown you. Just because things are not happening on your timeline does not mean the promise has changed. Just because it feels hard does not mean you are not called. Just because you don't see the full picture yet does not mean God isn't working. The challenge is that we often think doubt is something we have to wait to overcome before we move forward. But overcoming doubt doesn't happen before the step, it happens in the step. Confidence doesn't come from having all the answers, it comes from trusting the one who does. If Moses had waited until he felt qualified, he never would have left the wilderness. If Peter had waited until he fully understood how walking on water worked, he never would have stepped out of the boat. Sometimes you have to move in obedience even when doubt is present. Because faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to move forward despite it. The enemy knows that if he can keep you doubting yourself, you will never fully walk in the authority God has given you. He will make you compare your journey to someone else's, making you feel like you're behind, like you missed your moment. He will remind you of every mistake, every failure, every insecurity, hoping you will disqualify yourself. But here's what you have to remember. If God marked you, nothing and no one, not even you, can unmark you. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to wait until you feel 100% ready. The call of God on your life is not based on perfection. It is based on His grace. And His grace is sufficient. So don't let doubt keep you stuck in a place you were never meant to stay. Don't let the enemy convince you that your weaknesses disqualify you. The fact that you have doubts does not mean you are not chosen. It simply means you are human. But faith says, even if I don't see how it will work out, I trust that God does. And when you live from that place, nothing, no fear, no doubt, no insecurity can stop you from stepping into everything He has called you to be. Who you surround yourself with matters. The people in your life are either watering the seed of purpose within you or suffocating it. They are either reminding you of who you are or making you question it. Purpose was never meant to be walked out in isolation, but it also wasn't meant to be surrounded by the wrong company. And sometimes what feels like stagnation in your life is not. Because you're not called, it's because you're connected to people who don't see it. There are relationships that encourage your faith, and there are relationships that feed your doubt. There are people who will stretch you, challenge you, and push you toward what God has for you. And there are people who will keep you comfortable, stuck in cycles you were meant to break out of. This is why discernment is so important. Not everyone can go where God is taking you. Not everyone will understand what He's doing in you. And that's okay. But what's not okay is allowing people who don't carry the vision to speak into it. Think about Jesus. Even He was intentional about His circle. Out of the crowds, He had the 12. And even among the 12, there were moments He only took Peter, James, and John. Why? Because when you're walking in purpose, you have to be mindful of who you allow close. When He went to heal Jairus' daughter, He only brought a select few into the room. Why? Because atmosphere matters. Who you surround yourself with in moments of faith matters. If Jesus was intentional about who He allowed to witness certain miracles, how much more should we be? Some of the battles you're fighting right now are not even about you. They're about who you are connected to. The enemy knows that if he can't take you out, he'll try to keep you connected to people who drain you. People who make you second guess your calling. People who project their own fears onto you. But the longer you entertain the wrong voices, the harder it is to hear God's voice. The longer you keep people close who don't see what's on your life, the easier it is to settle into a version of yourself that is beneath who God called you to be. This is why you have to protect your space. You have to be intentional about the voices you allow to speak into your life. Surround yourself with people who remind you of God's promises, not just your problems. People who challenge you to grow, not just people who keep you comfortable. People who can see beyond where you are and speak to where you're going. Because when you are surrounded by the right people, your faith is strengthened. Your vision becomes clearer. Your passion is reignited. And suddenly, what felt impossible begins to feel within reach. But here's the truth. Not everyone will understand your journey, and that's okay. Not everyone will celebrate what God is doing in you, and that's okay too. You don't need everyone to believe in you. You just need the right people. Even Jesus had people doubt him. Even Jesus had people reject him, but he never let that stop him from fulfilling his purpose. And you can't either. Maybe the shift you need to make isn't in what you're doing, but in who you're surrounding yourself with. Maybe you've been feeling stuck because you've been holding on to relationships that expired a long time ago. Maybe God has been trying to open new doors, but you've been afraid to let go of the old ones. But when you are walking in purpose, you have to trust that the people who are meant to be part of your journey will align with what God is doing in your life. And those who are not meant to go with you, let them go, because you can't afford to carry dead weight into your next season. There is too much on your life. There is too much ahead of you. And when you are surrounded by the right people, you will be reminded of that. So be intentional, be prayerful, surround yourself with people who push you toward God's purpose, not away from it. Because the company you keep will either sharpen your faith or shake it. And when you're marked by God, you need people around you who see it, honor it, and call it out in you, even on the days you forget who you are. There comes a moment when you have to decide that your past will no longer hold you captive. A moment when you realize that everything you've been through, every disappointment, every failure, every wrong turn was never meant to define you, only to refine you. But the enemy wants to keep you stuck in a cycle of regret, reminding you of everything that went wrong so that you never step into what could go right. He wants you to believe that because of what happened, you are no longer qualified, no longer worthy, no longer capable of being used by God. But that is a lie. God does not call the perfect, he calls the willing. He calls those who are willing to trust him beyond their past, beyond their mistakes, beyond their shortcomings. There is no failure that is greater than God's redemption. There is no mistake that is powerful enough to cancel his purpose for your life. But if the enemy can convince you otherwise, if he can keep you looking back, he can stop you from moving forward. And this is why you have to make a decision, not just once, but daily, to break free from the weight of what was and step boldly into what is ahead. The Bible is full of people who had every reason to believe they were disqualified. David had a past, Moses had a past, Paul had a past, but none of that stopped God from using them. If anything, their past became the very thing that made their testimony even more powerful. And if God could redeem them, what makes you think he can't redeem you? What makes you think that what you've done, what you've been through, is somehow beyond his ability to restore? The truth is, God already factored in your failures when he called you. He already knew the mistakes you would make, the wrong turns you would take, and yet he still chose you because his grace is greater. His plan is bigger. His purpose for your life is not fragile. The danger of holding on to the past is that it robs you of the future God has for you. It keeps you in cycles of shame, replaying moments that God has already forgiven. It makes you hesitant to move forward, fearful that history will repeat itself. But the moment you surrender your past to God, the moment you truly release it, you step into the freedom that has been waiting for you all along. The enemy wants you to stay bound, but God has called you to be free. And freedom starts with the decision to believe that you are not what happened to you, to believe that you are not the mistakes you've made, to believe that what is ahead is greater than what is behind. Some of you have been carrying things that God never asked you to carry. You've been punishing yourself for things that God has already forgiven. You've been living in the shadow of past pain, past heartbreak, past disappointment. But God is saying, it's time to let it go. It's time to stop rehearsing the past and start embracing the future. It's time to stop allowing guilt to keep you bound when grace has already set you free. Your past does not disqualify you, it prepares you. Everything you've walked through, everything you've endured is part of your testimony. The very thing the enemy tried to use to break you is what God will use to bless others. The very story you thought was over is the one that will inspire someone else to keep going. But you have to decide that you will not be held hostage by yesterday. You have to decide that you will no longer define yourself by what happened, but by what God is doing now. It doesn't matter how far you think you've strayed. It doesn't matter how many wrong turns you've taken. The moment you say yes to God, He restores, He redeems, He makes all things new. So don't allow the past to keep you from the greater that is ahead. You are not disqualified. You are not forgotten. You are not too broken to be used by God. You are marked for something greater, and as long as you keep moving forward, nothing, not your past, not your failures, not even your own doubts, can stop what God has already set in motion.